The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Phyllis Summers had always believed that love and destruction were two sides of the same coin, and she had spent her life flipping that coin again and again until she could no longer tell which side she was holding. The day she learned that Danny Romalotti was going to marry Christine Blair, something inside her broke for good. It wasn't just jealousy, it was history clawing its way back from the grave. She told herself she was protecting him, saving him from a mistake, but the truth was simpler and far darker. She could not stand to see him love someone else. In her mind, their story was unfinished, and she refused to let another woman, especially Christine, write the ending. Genoa City buzzed with excitement over the upcoming wedding, but Phyllis saw it as an opportunity, not a celebration. Her smile in public was disarmingly calm, yet behind closed doors her eyes glimmered with the fury of a storm gathering strength. The wedding was meant to be the triumph of second chances. Christine, after years of loneliness and quiet endurance, had found her way back to warmth through Danny. He had been her first love, the one who understood the rhythm of her heart even after time had scattered them apart. But buried beneath her bridal joy was the ache of unfinished business, the ghost of Paul Williams. Paul had been her husband, her anchor, and the man whose sudden disappearance had hollowed her out. He had left without explanation, without even a goodbye, leaving behind questions that became wounds. When she finally accepted that he was gone for good, she let herself begin again with Danny. But Phyllis knew the truth that Christine had buried: the marriage had never been formally dissolved. On paper, Christine was still Mrs. Williams, and that sliver of legality became the seed of Phyllis's plan. Phyllis began by stirring whispers, small and precise, like a surgeon cutting into soft tissue. She fed gossip to the right people, leaked fragments of the past to reporters who owed her favors, and even managed to track down clues about Paul's whereabouts. She didn't want justice, she wanted chaos. It was easy enough. Paul's self-imposed exile had left behind unanswered questions and unclosed wounds. He had vanished after a series of personal failures, retreating into isolation, haunted by cases gone wrong and by his belief that he no longer belonged in the world he had once protected. But Phyllis found him. She wrote to him, weaving words of betrayal and urgency, telling him that his wife was about to marry another man, a man who had never truly respected him. Her letter dripped with half-truths and venom, exactly the kind of poison she knew would wake the dormant fury in his heart. She told him that Christine had moved on without shame, that she was parading her happiness in front of the entire city. Phyllis didn't have to lie much. The wedding was real, after all, but she twisted the truth just enough to make Paul's blood boil. For Christine, the days leading up to the ceremony were a blur of nervous excitement. The world around her seemed to shimmer with fragile hope. She convinced herself that she deserved this, that life was finally giving her peace after years of grief and loneliness. She didn't know that her peace was already bleeding from the inside. Phyllis, all smiles and false civility, pretended to wish her well while working tirelessly behind the scenes to pull every string that would make the day unravel. She even attended the rehearsal dinner, feigning warmth while secretly ensuring that invitations reached certain people who should never have been invited. Among them was Paul Williams himself. On the morning of the wedding, Genoa City was bathed in sunlight that felt almost mocking. The chapel was filled with flowers, friends, and the soft hum of anticipation. Danny waited at the altar, dressed in understated grace, his eyes filled with quiet love as he watched Christine approach. She was radiant, fragile, trembling beneath the weight of a happiness she hadn't dared to dream about. Everything about the ceremony felt perfect: the music, the vows, the murmurs of joy from the guests. But perfection in Genoa City was always a prelude to disaster. Outside, a man stood in the shadows, his face hardened by years of silence. Paul had returned, but not as the man he once was. His eyes were sharper, colder, and filled with the bitterness of betrayal. He had read Phyllis's letter over and over during his journey back, each line igniting another spark of rage. The thought of Christine marrying another man while still bound to him was intolerable. In his mind, she was the one who had broken their vows, not he who had disappeared. As the officiant began to speak, a murmur swept through the back of the room. The door opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Heads turned, whispers rippled like wildfire. Christine froze mid-breath, her body going cold as she saw him, Paul Williams, standing in the aisle like an apparition summoned by guilt. The silence that followed was suffocating. Danny's face paled, he knew instantly that something catastrophic was about to happen. Phyllis, seated near the back, hid a smile behind her trembling hand. Her plan had worked perfectly. Paul's voice broke the stillness, raw and furious. He shouted her name, demanding to know how she could stand there in white, promising forever to another man while still wearing the title of his wife. His words spilled out like bullets, each one sharper than the last. He called her a liar, a traitor, a woman who had erased their past as if it meant nothing. The crowd gasped, some rising from their seats, others frozen in disbelief. Christine's heart pounded so violently she thought she might faint. She tried to speak, to explain, but her voice was lost beneath Paul's fury. Danny stepped forward, attempting to shield her, but that only provoked Paul further. His anger turned physical, he grabbed Danny by the collar, his voice shaking with rage as he accused him of stealing what wasn't his to take. Danny barely had time to react before Paul's fist connected with his jaw, sending him staggering backward. The crowd erupted in chaos, screams, gasps, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Christine stood motionless, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't control. She wanted to defend them both, but she didn't even know who deserved her defense anymore. The man who had vanished and returned a stranger, or the one who had given her back her laughter but now bled in front of her because of the past she never escaped. Her bouquet fell to the floor, the petals scattering like fragments of the life she had tried to rebuild. Paul's rage eventually crumbled into something pitiful, a mixture of grief and confusion. His voice cracked as he accused her not of betrayal, but of forgetting him, of erasing him from her story. For a brief moment, Christine saw the man she had once loved, buried beneath the ruin of pride and heartbreak. Security intervened, pulling Paul back, but the damage was done. Cameras had captured everything, the scandal was already spreading. The wedding was over before it began. Danny, bruised but composed, refused to let the chaos consume him. He reached for Christine, but she flinched, her body torn between comfort and guilt. The look in her eyes was one of total devastation. She wasn't angry at Paul for interrupting, nor at Phyllis for orchestrating it, she was angry at herself for believing she could ever outrun the past. The chapel emptied slowly, leaving behind silence and shattered flowers. Later, as the night settled over the city, Christine sat alone in her bridal gown, staring at her reflection in a mirror that no longer seemed to recognize her. The makeup had smudged, the veil was torn, and her eyes were hollow. She didn't know whether to cry or to laugh at the cruelty of it all. Phyllis had won, but her victory was hollow too. Watching from afar, she realized that she hadn't reclaimed love, she had only proven that destruction was the only language she knew. Paul, meanwhile, wandered through the city he once called home, lost and uncertain, his anger spent but his heart still shattered. And Danny, sitting alone in his car, stared at the ring that would never find its place on Christine's hand. The aftermath spread like a quiet infection through Genoa City. Everyone had an opinion, everyone whispered theories, but only 3 people knew the full truth, and none of them found peace in it. Christine knew she could never forgive Phyllis, yet she couldn't summon hatred either. She had once pitied her, then feared her, and now understood her too well. They were both women shaped by love that refused to die. Paul's return, though meant to expose betrayal, had only revealed how broken they all were. And Phyllis, sitting in her darkened apartment, realized that in destroying Christine's happiness, she had also destroyed her own last illusion, that pain could ever bring her satisfaction. Outside, rain began to fall, washing away the confetti that had never been thrown. Genoa City slept uneasily, its streets glistening under the dim glow of regret. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, once meant to celebrate a union, now tolling like a requiem for love that had turned to ruin. The chapel that had once been filled with music and laughter now trembled under the weight of disbelief. The wedding guests had frozen in their seats as if the world had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Danny Romalotti stood at the altar, his face drained of color, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. Beside him, Christine Blair could barely form a thought. For a brief, surreal moment, it felt as if the air had thickened, trapping them both inside a nightmare that wore the face of someone she once loved. Paul Williams stood in the doorway like a shadow resurrected, eyes burning with betrayal, fury, and something that looked disturbingly like heartbreak. He had returned from oblivion, from years of silence, and he had chosen this exact moment to reclaim what he believed was still his. The timing was too perfect, too cruel, too deliberate. Christine's mind raced, and through the panic that clawed at her chest, she realized what this was. Phyllis Summers. Of course it was her. Only Phyllis had both the malice and precision to stage something this catastrophic. The sound of Paul's footsteps echoed across the marble floor as he advanced toward the altar. The crowd, paralyzed by shock, parted instinctively. Christine's eyes filled with tears, not because she still loved him, but because she could see the madness in his face. There was no trace of the gentleman she once knew. He was raw, wild, a man consumed by the illusion that he had been wronged. His voice thundered through the hall, filled with accusation and bitterness. He called her a liar, claimed she had betrayed him, that she had erased him from her life like a ghost. Danny tried to speak, tried to calm him, but his words only fueled the fire. Paul's fury broke free, years of pain erupting in a single violent instant. With a sudden, powerful motion, he lunged forward and struck Danny across the face. The sound of the impact cracked through the air like thunder, and chaos followed. Guests gasped and screamed, some rushing toward the doors, others cowering in disbelief. The elegant ceremony collapsed into a storm of panic. Danny stumbled back, clutching his jaw, his vision blurred by the sudden shock. For a second, he didn't even recognize where he was. The ring he had meant to place on Christine's finger fell from his trembling hand and rolled across the floor, coming to rest near the scattered petals that now looked like stains. Paul's breathing was ragged, his rage only deepening as he shouted over the cries of those trying to stop him. Christine tried to reach him, her voice trembling, begging him to stop, to listen, but Paul's anger drowned her out. The officiant fled. The musicians had long since stopped playing. The crowd was thinning fast as guests rushed toward the exits, terrified that something worse might happen. Christine's family and close friends, Devin, Yabby, Tracy, and Jack, rushed forward to separate the two men before the situation turned deadly. Paul's hands shook as he was restrained, his chest rising and falling like a man possessed. His voice cracked with rage and sorrow, repeating the same words again and again, that she had betrayed him, that she had ruined everything they had once been. The echo of his pain filled the chapel like a haunting chorus. Danny, blood on his lip and fury behind his eyes, refused to strike back. He wasn't going to give Phyllis, or anyone else, the satisfaction of seeing him descend into that same madness. But as he looked at Christine, he saw her trembling and broken, and he knew that something fundamental had shattered between them. The wedding was over, not just because of the fight, but because of what had been exposed, the ghosts of the past, the lies of omission, and the invisible hand that had guided it all. In the corner of the room, Phyllis Summers stood still, her lips curving into a smile that was both victorious and terrifying. She had watched the chaos unfold exactly as she had imagined it, every scream and every tear an echo of her success. For weeks she had manipulated the pieces, sent the letters, whispered the secrets, and planted just enough confusion to make Paul's return feel inevitable. Now she stood as the architect of ruin, her satisfaction masked beneath feigned concern. To the untrained eye, she might have looked shocked like everyone else, but her eyes told another story. This was the moment she had worked for, the collapse of Christine's perfect little fairy tale. In Phyllis's mind, this was justice. She had been humiliated too many times, cast aside, mocked for her obsession, labeled the villain in stories written by others. But today, she was the one pulling the strings, and it felt glorious. Christine's cries echoed through the broken silence as she turned toward Paul, her heart torn between pity and rage. The realization that he had allowed himself to be manipulated into this moment hit her like a blade. She shouted that she loved Danny, that Paul was the past, that he had chosen to leave and she had chosen to live. But her words fell like stones into a storm. Paul's expression twisted with disbelief. His world had stopped the day he left, but Christine's had gone on without him, and he couldn't comprehend that life had moved forward without his permission. His anger wasn't only about love, it was about control, about being forgotten. He had wanted to be mourned, not replaced. And Phyllis had known exactly which wound to press. Danny stood beside Christine now, his hand on her shoulder, blood drying on his skin. He tried to comfort her, but she recoiled, not from him, but from the entire nightmare that surrounded them. Her dress, once radiant white, was streaked with tears and disarray. The altar behind them looked like the remains of a battlefield. Christine's voice broke as she declared that she wanted nothing more than peace, that all she had ever wanted was to move on. But peace was the one thing Phyllis would never let her have. The redhead watched as the chaos unfolded, her victory hollow yet intoxicating. She had succeeded in ruining the wedding, but as she stood there in the flickering candlelight, even she could feel the chill of what she had unleashed. There was no going back now. The police arrived minutes later, escorting Paul from the chapel as guests whispered and filmed on their phones. The once respected detective now looked like a broken man dragged from the ruins of his pride. Christine couldn't even bring herself to look at him. When the doors finally closed behind him, the silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the faint hum of a violin that had been left playing in the background, hauntingly out of place. One by one, the remaining guests slipped away until only a few family members were left, faces heavy with shock, pity, and exhaustion. Christine collapsed into a pew, trembling, her hands clutching the edge of her gown as if to keep from falling apart completely. Danny sat beside her, speechless, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and helplessness. He wanted to say that they could still fix it, that love could survive even this, but the words wouldn't come. There were no vows now, no future, only the wreckage of what might have been. She turned to him with eyes that had lost all light and whispered that Phyllis had done this, that no one else could have orchestrated something so cruel, so exact. Danny didn't need convincing. He knew Phyllis too well. Her fingerprints were all over the disaster, from the timing of Paul's return to the eruption of chaos that followed. Outside, Phyllis walked away from the chapel with her head held high, her heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks to a twisted symphony. The night air was cool, almost cleansing, and she breathed it in like victory. For once, she felt alive again, powerful, in control of a story that had long since written her out. She told herself that she had done what needed to be done, that Christine's happiness had been nothing but a lie built on the bones of others' pain. But deep down, in the quiet corner of her conscience that still remembered love, a whisper of unease crept in. What if this wasn't triumph? What if this was damnation? Inside the chapel, Christine lifted her tear-stained face and stared at the shattered altar. She had lost her wedding, her peace, and the illusion that her past could be buried. She knew now that Phyllis would never stop, that as long as jealousy and obsession existed, her life would never be free of that shadow. Danny, weary but unbroken, placed his hand over hers, silently promising that they would rebuild. But in his heart, he wasn't sure if that was possible. Some wounds don't heal, they only scar. And as the last candles burned down, the scent of smoke and wilted flowers filled the room, marking the end of what was meant to be the happiest day of their lives. Outside, Phyllis disappeared into the darkness, her smile fading into something more complicated, part pride, part loneliness, part regret. She had won the battle, but in Genoa City, every victory came with a price. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could already feel the next storm gathering, the next secret unraveling, the next heart ready to break. Because for Phyllis Summers, peace was never the goal. The chaos was the only thing that made her feel alive.